In the heart of 17th century France, where kings ruled by divine right and royal blood was the thread binding nations, a child was born who would reshape the meaning of monarchy. He was named Louis the God-given. On September 5, 1638, France rejoiced. After more than 2 decades of marriage, King Louis XIII and Queen Anne of Austria had finally produced an heir. The people celebrated the birth as a miracle, a gift from heaven. But this miracle child would soon bear more than the hopes of a dynasty. He would carry the destiny of a nation. At the age of 4, Louis became king. His father passed away in 1643, leaving the throne to a child still learning to speak in full sentences. Real power lay in the hands of his mother, Queen Anne, and her chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin. Yet young Louis was no mere figurehead. He watched and listened. He observed the fragile balance of influence and control, and in the shadows of court politics, he learned an unshakable truth. Kings must rule, not be ruled. France at that time was fracturing. The nobility challenged the crown. The Fronde, a series of civil uprisings, shook the kingdom to its core. Louis and his mother were even forced to flee Paris at one point. From these formative traumas, the young king developed a deep distrust of unruly nobles and disloyal ministers. Authority, he concluded, must reside fully and visibly in the sovereign. When Cardinal Mazarin died in 1661, the now 23-year-old king shocked the court. They expected a new minister. Instead, Louis declared, Louis XIV resolute, "I intend to govern alone." And so he did. With discipline, vision, and relentless ambition, Louis XIV reshaped the monarchy. He worked tirelessly reading dispatches, reviewing budgets, attending councils. He was not a king in name only. He was a working ruler. To symbolize his unique place at the center of France, Louis adopted the image of Apollo, the sun god. He became known as the Roi Soleil, the Sun King. Just as the sun brings light and order to the universe, Louis would bring unity and splendor to France. In this new royal order, everything revolved around him. Nobles were invited to his glittering court, not to govern, but to serve, flatter, and compete for his favor. He bound them to Versailles through ceremony and surveillance, weakening their independent power while dazzling them with the grandeur of monarchy. His image, his rituals, his very presence became tools of control. But behind the light, shadows grew. The same absolute power that unified France would one day strain it. The same gold that adorned Versailles would be drawn from the heavy taxes of peasants. The boy who had once fled rebellion now ruled through spectacle and discipline. And across Europe, the world turned its eyes toward a new kind of king, a godlike ruler who promised glory, order, and magnificence. The rise of Louis XIV had begun. Louis XIV did not just rule France, he became it. His reign was more than administration. It was architecture, performance, ritual, and control. Every moment of his monarchy was designed to reflect one truth: power resided in him alone. When he relocated his court to the modest hunting lodge at Versailles in 1682, he did not simply change addresses, he reshaped the very idea of kingship. Versailles became a living symbol of absolutism. Its endless halls, golden gates, and mirror-lined galleries proclaimed the grandeur of the Sun King. From every arch and garden pathway came the same message: France has one center, and that center is Louis. The palace was a stage. Each day began with the lever, the king's waking ritual. Nobles vied for the privilege of passing him a shirt, a shoe, a comb. These gestures, seemingly mundane, were mechanisms of control. By engaging his courtiers in elaborate, meaningless ceremony, Louis distracted them from governance and drew them into his orbit. They became actors in his pageant, loyal, dependent, and ever watchful of their place in the royal constellation. The king was not idle. He worked long hours reviewing policies, managing appointments, and overseeing budgets. He demanded reports from ministers, scrutinized documents, and even dictated styles of clothing and etiquette. Louis saw himself not just as ruler, but as architect of order, civil, military, economic, and spiritual. Under his direction, France became a model of centralized power. He expanded the army into the largest in Europe. He reformed taxation and enforced royal justice across the provinces. His trusted minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, invigorated trade and industry. Ports were expanded, roads were paved, artisans were subsidized. French goods from tapestries to lace filled the homes of Europe's elite. And with prosperity came projection. Louis commissioned grand fountains, sculptures, paintings, and music. He had himself painted as Jupiter, the king of gods. Theater, opera, and ballet flourished under his patronage, each performance a reflection of his glory. But Louis's hunger for greatness did not end at the border. He waged war almost continuously, the War of Devolution, the Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, and the War of the Spanish Succession. These conflicts expanded France's reach and influence, but at great cost. Treasure drained. Taxes rose. The countryside, romanticized in art, suffered from famine and neglect. Still, inside Versailles, the illusion remained unbroken. Diplomats bowed, nobles schemed for favor. The Sun King shined unopposed. Yet beneath the gold leaf and orchestras, the machinery creaked. Strains spread through the kingdom like a hairline crack beneath porcelain. His glory remained intact, but the foundation beneath it was quietly beginning to wear thin. Louis XIV had created a world in which every movement, every law, every heartbeat belonged to the monarchy. He had forged a system of majesty and machinery. But no machine, no matter how divine, escapes the wear of time. The decline of Louis XIV began not with an enemy at the gate, but with a whisper beneath the skin. In the summer of 1715, the air at Versailles hung thick with heat. The gardens bloomed as they always had. The fountains still danced for the king. But behind the gilded doors of his private chamber, something was changing. A pain had settled in his left leg, sharp, persistent, and growing. The king, now 76 years old, dismissed it at first. A lifetime of wars, injuries, and age had made him accustomed to discomfort. But this was different. The pain deepened. His leg swelled, then it began to blacken. A foul smell emerged, subtle at first, then overpowering. The physicians exchanged uneasy glances. They whispered behind closed doors, consulted ancient texts, and tried the usual concoctions: wine, herbs, poultices. Nothing worked. The truth crept in like the illness itself. It was gangrene. A rot had taken hold inside the body of the son. King, the word carried fear. In 1715, there were no antiseptics, no antibiotics, no real knowledge of infection. The only option was amputation, a dangerous procedure at the best of times. For a 76-year-old monarch, it was tantamount to a death sentence. And so, they did nothing. Or rather, they watched, they applied ointments, offered prayers, and tried to hide the spreading necrosis. The court began to smell of incense and vinegar. Nobles passed in and out of the king's room with faces of forced calm. The stench of death lingered, thick and inescapable. Still, Louis remained composed. He had lived too long and ruled too fiercely to lose dignity now. He continued to hold audiences from his bed, issued orders, and asked to be kept informed on affairs of state. But he knew his body was failing him. On August 25th, the feast of St. Louis's namesake, he summoned his 5-year-old great-grandson, the future Louis XV. In a voice weakened by pain, he offered final counsel: do not imitate me in my taste for war. Seek peace, relieve your people, let your reign be one of healing. It was a moment of clarity, humility, and legacy. The absolute monarch who had spent his life in conquest now urged peace. The man who had built Versailles now left it behind. By the end of August, the rot had spread. His leg, once hidden beneath silks and brocade, was now black, bloated, and beyond salvation. The physicians could do little more than make him comfortable. Every movement brought agony. Every breath grew shallower. The Sun King, once radiant, untouchable, lay decaying from within. The palace held its breath. The courtiers, once dazzled by gold and power, now moved in silence. The music had stopped. The mirrors reflected not majesty, but mortality. The king of kings was dying, not by blade or betrayal, but by the slow, silent creep of rot. By the final days of August 1715, the once dazzling court of Versailles was steeped in shadow. The fountains still flowed, The chandeliers still glowed. But behind the velvet-draped doors of the king's chamber, the scene was grim. Louis XIV, the Sun King, the embodiment of absolutism, was dying. The gangrene that had crept into his leg now consumed him. His flesh had blackened, his limbs had swollen. The smell of decay had overtaken the incense burned by desperate priests. The most powerful monarch in Europe lay fading, not in glory, but in rot. He was 76 years old, having reigned for 72 of them. No king in European history had ruled so long. No ruler had woven power and pageantry so tightly into the fabric of a nation. And now, the body that had withstood wars, rebellion, and scandal was surrendering quietly, irrevocably. The court moved in whispers. Doctors stood by, helpless. Courtiers filed in and out of his room, not for conversation, but for spectacle, for history. To be present in the final moments of a man who had once seemed immortal, Louis remained lucid. He issued final decrees. He signed documents from his bed. He gave orders for the regency that would follow his death. But his voice had grown thin, and his pain unrelenting. The grandeur that surrounded him, gold, silk, the mirrored halls, had become a cage of splendor for a dying king. On August 26th, he received the sacrament. His confessor leaned close. The king, though breathless and worn, confessed, received communion, and asked forgiveness for his sins. He accepted his fate without illusion. The man who once ruled as God's lieutenant now bowed to a higher power. To his heir, the 5-year-old Louis XV, he offered one final truth. I have loved war too much. Do not follow my example. Make peace. Be a good king. The candle of a dynasty flickered. By August 30th, he could no longer speak. His breath rattled in his chest. His eyes remained closed. His body motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of his rib cage. Ministers stood in silence. Nobles waited. Versailles itself seemed to hold its breath. And then on the morning of September 1st, 1715, he was gone. No trumpet sounded. No great bell tolled. Just stillness. The Sun King had set. The death of Louis XIV was not a dramatic finale, but a quiet unraveling. His body, bloated and blackened, was all that remained of a man who had styled himself divine. For decades, France had turned around him like planets around the sun. And now that center had vanished. Beyond the palace, word spread quickly. In churches, they prayed. In salons, they speculated. In the fields, many peasants felt little change except perhaps the distant hope of lighter burdens. Inside Versailles, a herald's voice rang out. The king is dead. Long live the king. Louis XV was now monarch, but he was a child, and behind him lay the shadow of a reign so vast, so gilded, and so flawed, it would echo through France for generations to come. The king was dead, but his body still belonged to the monarchy. In death, Louis XIV was no longer just a man. He was ritual, tradition, and legacy. The machinery of royal burial had been perfected over centuries, and for a monarch who reigned for 72 years, it would operate in full. And yet, there was a problem. His body had decayed far too quickly. Gangrene had taken its toll. The blackened flesh, the bloated limbs, the odor of death. Nothing could disguise the truth. The Sun King was rotting. Even the embalmers hesitated. The smell in his bedchamber was unbearable. Physicians and priests could hardly remain inside. His once vibrant form, painted and sculpted in marble across the kingdom, now threatened to disintegrate before he ever reached his tomb. Still, the rituals proceeded. According to royal tradition, the king's body would be divided 3 burials, 3 sacred sites. First, his heart, symbol of his virtue and piety, was removed and placed in a silver urn. It would be sent to the Jesuits of the Collège de Clermont in Paris. Next, his entrails, representing his human frailty, were sealed in another container and delivered to the Church of Notre Dame. And finally, what remained of his body was to be buried in the royal necropolis, the Basilica of Saint Denis, where generations of French kings lay in eternal rest. On September 2nd, Louis's corpse, poorly embalmed and hastily prepared, was dressed in ceremonial robes. A golden scepter was placed in his stiffened hand. The royal guards stood in solemn procession. Drums sounded as his coffin was carried out of Versailles for the last time. But even in death, his body resisted containment. The rot advanced. Gas built up inside the sealed coffin. Days later, on the journey to St. Denis, the pressure became too great. In the middle of the procession, with nobles, soldiers, and clergy in attendance, his coffin exploded. The crowd recoiled in horror. The air was filled with the unbearable stench of decay. The royal guards scrambled to contain what remained of the Sun King. It was a grotesque finale to a reign that had been all about spectacle, order, and control. By the time he reached St. Denis, Louis XIV's body was barely intact. The opulence of his burial contrasted cruelly with the state of his remains. As clergy chanted and candles flickered, the decayed corpse of the greatest monarch in France was lowered into the crypt beside kings who had ruled with far less glory, but had perhaps died with more grace. The burial site would not remain untouched. Less than 80 years later, during the French Revolution, mobs would descend upon St. Denis. The tombs were desecrated, bones scattered. The Bourbon dynasty symbolized oppression, and Louis XIV, even in death, was not spared the judgment of history. His heart was lost, his body exhumed, the monuments shattered. What remained of the king who built Versailles, who commanded Europe, and who declared l'état, c'est moi, was ash and legend. The body was broken, but the myth endured. Louis XIV ruled France longer than any other monarch in European history. For 72 years, he was not merely king, he was France. His face adorned coins. His words became law. His presence reshaped art, architecture, and diplomacy. He turned monarchy into theater, and himself into its star. But as the dust settled on his tomb, what remained? His legacy, like his body, is a story of grandeur and decay. In life, Louis XIV elevated France to unmatched heights. He forged a centralized state with a standing army, loyal bureaucracy, and cultural dominance that turned Paris into the envy of Europe. Under his command, French became the language of courts. French fashion set global trends. French art and philosophy flourished. Versailles, his golden creation, stood not only as a palace, but as a political masterpiece. It subdued the nobility without bloodshed, tethered power to proximity, and transformed the role of monarch from administrator to embodiment of the state. He was the Sun King, shining unchallenged at the center of everything. And yet, the shadows he cast were long. His endless wars drained the treasury. His obsession with glory buried generations of Frenchmen. His revocation of the Edict of Nantes forced over 100,000 Protestants to flee, gutting the kingdom of artisans, scholars, and merchants. While his court dazzled, peasants starved, the tax burden crushed the poor, bread riots simmered beneath the polished floors of Versailles. When he died, he left a child to inherit a kingdom strained by debt, division, and discontent. That child, Louis XV, would be weak. His grandson, Louis XVI, would be guillotined. The seeds of revolution were not sown overnight, but Louis XIV planted many of them. The grandeur he built created expectation. The taxes he levied created resentment. The myth of divine kingship he reinforced created disillusionment. When revolution came in 1789, it was not just bread the people demanded, it was justice for a century of absolutist rule. Even in death, Louis could not escape history's reckoning. His tomb was desecrated, his body scattered, but his story endured. To some, he is the very model of kingship, majestic, visionary, and unrelenting. To others, he is a tyrant draped in silk, who bled his people for fountains and war. Both can be true. He made France modern. He made it magnificent, and he made it fragile. Louis XIV taught the world what monarchy could become, but he also taught it what happens when kings forget they are mortal. His final chapter wasn't written in marble or mirrors, but in blackened flesh, a burst coffin, and a sun that finally fell. His kingdom survived him. His shadow never left it. The sun had set, but its light did not disappear. Long after Louis XIV was lowered into the crypt at St. Denis, long after his palace faded into soft candlelight, and his courtiers bowed to new masters, the echo of his reign continued to ripple through time. France changed. The monarchy faltered. The revolution swept across the land like a storm. toppling centuries of tradition in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Yet even as the heads of kings rolled and palaces burned, Louis XIV remained untouchable in myth, towering. In memory, he had built a legacy on ritual, image, and power. And long after the gold of Versailles dulled, its influence endured. Every absolute ruler who followed, whether monarch, emperor, or dictator, studied his model. He had shown how to use spectacle to rule, how to manipulate nobility with theater, and how to bend culture to serve control. His name became shorthand for grandeur, his palace the standard for ambition. Even revolutionaries could not ignore him. They defiled his tomb, scattered his bones, and tried to erase his image, but they did so with the awareness that he was the origin of what they were tearing down. His monarchy was the mountain they had to descend to reach the republic, and in quieter ways, he remained. In music and opera, in fashion and language, in architecture, echoed across Europe, and in capitals far from France, Versailles became a blueprint for every royal court that wished to impress or intimidate. Its gardens copied, its etiquette studied, its glitter envied. Even the modern idea of centralized governance owes a debt to the king who ruled alone. But the deeper legacy of Louis XIV is more complex. He embodied both the glory and the tragedy of human ambition. He showed what happens when one man becomes a nation, when the will of a sovereign replaces the voice of a people. He offered splendor, yes, but also silence, control, but at a cost. His death by decay became the metaphor his reign could not avoid. No matter how brilliant the surface, corruption from within can rot the foundation, and even the most luminous star must burn itself out. Yet Louis XIV remains one of history's great enigmas, both admired and admonished. Was he France's greatest king, or the architect of its fall? Was he the father of French culture, or the shadow over its future? Perhaps he was both. Perhaps that is the true echo of the Sun King, not just in gold and war, in fountains and flair, but in the eternal reminder that power, when unchallenged, shines brightest just before it dims. And so, centuries later, we still remember him. Louis the Great, Louis the God-given, Louis the rotting king, a man who ruled an age and whose echo refuses to die. He tried to make himself eternal. From the gilded halls of Versailles to the canvases of great painters, from rituals crafted with precision to wars waged in his name, Louis XIV crafted not just a kingdom, but a myth, a world in which he did not merely reign, he radiated, and for a time, it worked. When he walked the mirrored galleries of Versailles, the reflections seemed endless. When he danced on stage as Apollo, the court gasped not in surprise, but reverence. The nobility didn't question, they bowed. The artists didn't critique, they praised. Even time appeared to yield before him. His reign stretched across generations. Children born during his coronation grew old and died still calling him king. But no illusion, no matter how dazzling, can hold forever. Behind the silks and ceremony, behind the gold-threaded tapestries and celestial metaphors, there was always a man who aged, a man who grieved, a man who suffered, a man who died in rot and pain, despite having ruled like a god. This contradiction between myth and mortality is the true legacy of Louis XIV. He believed himself chosen, and in many ways, he was chosen by birth, by fate, by history. But in the end, he was chosen to by death, the same as all others, flesh turned black, bones brittle, his heart separated from his body. His tomb desecrated by those he never imagined would rise, the illusion shattered, and yet the myth remains, because Louis XIV understood something that transcends politics and power: storytelling. He knew that people remember splendor more than struggle. They quote proclamations more than confessions. They visit palaces, not sickbeds. So when we speak his name, we picture not the decay but the dawn. Not the stench of gangrene but the scent of Versailles gardens. Not the dying breath but the rising curtain at the opera. He succeeded in death just as he did in life, not by escaping it, but by overshadowing it. He made himself unforgettable. Louis XIV lives on in marble, in mirrors, in music and memory. Not because he was immortal, but because he made us believe he was. And maybe that was the greatest illusion of all.